Afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke House, Clinical Assistant Professor here at Arts Media Engineering. And this is the next episode, I suppose, in our lecture series, the Digital Culture Lecture Series here at Arts Media Engineering at Arizona State University. Today's guest is Ania Malinowska. She's an author, cultural theorist, and associate professor in media and cultural studies at the Faculty of Humanities, University of Silesia in Poland, and a former Senior Fulbright Fellow at the New School in New York. Her research concentrates on cultural theory, love studies, digital humanities, and critical robotics, with a special focus on the formation of cultural norms and the social, emotional, and aesthetic codes in relation to digitalism. The title of her presentation is Technocultures of Love, Semiotics, Code, and Techne. And I'll just give a brief description and then turn it over to Ania. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Love is many things. First, it is a feeling, an emotion, a state, an attitude, a reaction, an intra and interpersonal relation. It is also a system of cultural significations, a tradition of expressing, justifying, and legitimizing behaviors associated with the feeling of love. But first and foremost, love is a practice, a way of doing and cultivating whatever and however that feeling manifests. It hence entails a number of tools, techniques, and instruments, or put broadly, technologies, that organize those manifestations and become love's second nature. Ania?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Luke. Thank you, Professor Couts, for having me, for organizing this. I'm very happy to be here, feeling very honored to be able to speak tonight, almost tonight, with and to give a certain overview on the most important question, which is the question of love. This is always the most important question. The question of love, greatly complicated by the idea of technoculture. I will try to explain a bit about what love might mean and might be, how it's being executed in the complicated context of technoculture, which is not that complicated as we might think. But before I do that, I just need to explain what I mean by love. And by love, I mean any relationship or any dynamic that is aimed at the formation of the we being in a romantic dynamic or a parent-child relationship or friendship or any other form of companionship. But of course, this debate on love, especially in the context of advanced high technologies, is dominated by what we understand as romance. A word of explanation. My presentation features an artwork by Spanish artist Noemi Iglesias Barrios, titled Of Love. It's a artistic project she did in relation to her own experience of online platform dating, which I use as an illustration and as a meta text of what I'm about to talk about today. Not because I deal a lot with online dating, but because I believe her deconstruction of that experience adds a lot to what I'm about to say. This talk is not the only reason why I'm here in Arizona. This talk is part of my extended field research aimed at tracking down old love testing machines that are sitting out there with private collectors or in museums. It's my first attempt at media archaeology, with which I would like to contribute to a deconstruction of our thinking about the technological dynamic or technology in general, especially its impact on our human cultures. And I mention this because, you know, this element of deconstruction is key to my talk tonight or today, but it's also key to my latest book. I don't know how to change the slide. To my latest book, so assistance is coming, to my latest book, Loving Contemporary Technoculture, that has been just released. Technical problems. Okay, thank you. It has been just released with Cambridge University Press, and which explains a lot what I mean by the problems of relationships and togetherness in a high-tech environment. This concept of deconstruction is also key to my long-running investment in robotics, which is a method of my own creation that I have used for reading robots and more broadly, reading technological objects in human context, specifically with regard to the emerging robot cultures and hybrid societies. And both of those incentives, so to speak, the idea of bond formation in technologically intense contexts, on the one hand, and the need for discognition or learning anew about the nature of technological things, tap into one of the most fundamental conflicts of late modernity. So, you know, the time like we experience now. The conflict formulated by late modern criticism, namely the assumption that technologies destroy or complicate our human experience, the human experience being seen as something pure and very noble and very domineering. And I'm sure that you've come across that assumption that technologies simply complicate our life, that like make our lives much worse. And what propels most like my research is a strong disagreement with that assumption. An assumption that I've been probing in relation to love, not only because love is my main expertise and interest, but also because the conflict of the human way and technology seems the most accurately lamented with respect to love or human emotional cultures and practices in general. What characterizes this late modern criticism of love is a position that the condition that organizes and characterizes contemporary feelings is liquefaction, namely a complete delusion of some kind of solidity of bonds and bond formation. In other words, we do not know how to love anymore. We do not love well. We're bad at loving, which, according to late modern criticism, shows through a number of symptoms. The three most important ones being, bingo, rash interactions and the acceleration of encounters. Number two, zero-risk policy and rationalization of fashion. And number three, the escalation of narcissism, self-fashioned auto-presentation. So let me briefly address each and every one of them. So what I mean by rash interactions and acceleration of encounters is related mostly with the idea of digital time that is in conflict with our social time. We simply cannot catch up with technological devices and technological objects or subjects. And it's also related with the human obsession to outperform time, specifically digital time, beyond like the biological capacity of our human shell. And this shows in a simple way, like the immediate satisfaction of like each and every need. We like, you know, satisfy our needs by a simple click. And Zygmunt Bauman, in this context, in relation to this like immediate satisfaction of each and every need of ours, compares love to ordering a pizza, saying that you just go online and order genitalia. When it comes to zero policy and rationalization of fashion, formulated respectively by Alain Badiou and Yves Deleuze, they represent a tendency to calculate the chances with respect to our investment into like some emotional labor. And Badiou, who is very critical about specifically about online dating or platform romance, says that we've lived a hype that reflects a safety first concept of love. It is love comprehensively, in short, against all risk and based on optimized calculation of chances. We no longer want to risk in love. And that is why what we do, we manage love with the so-called aggressive profiling. Yes, you know how online dating works, so I don't need to explain. He's simply like addressing the idea of data reality and computationality of data for like instant matches. And the final one, escalation of narcissism. This is a diagnosis proposed by German, Korean German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who speaks of like, you know, today, like more contemporary encounter as something based on self-fashioned, pre-designed auto-presentation. He says, he's talking about the corrosion of the other, namely we're not interested in the other, we're only interested in how we come across in a certain dynamic. He's talking about a tendency associated with libidinal atrophy, the death of desire, the death of libido, the progressing depression of desire, a depression that results from obscuring the trajectories of like a romantic, loving, libidinal exchange, which no longer goes from self to another, to the other person, but is a one scene. We're just completely invested into our own subjectivities. And my conflict with this does not like come from the fact that what they are saying is not true or not completely true. This is true. But you know, those symptoms and tendencies, they do not effectuate from technological advancement, as it has been suggested. In other words, the big flaw of all those critical voices is that they tend to romanticize, pun intended, glamorize the human way by means of a very popular and extremely myopic timeline that of before and after technology. And it's like one of the biggest critical lies in relation to anything like concerned like technological advancement. And the same thing happens with our general assessment of the technological environment and technological devices, including the environments, you know, the histories, which tend to rely on certain material and ontological dualities, yes, bipolarities, that of natural, artificial, analog, digital, organic, inorganic, and further genuine, ingenuine, positive, negative, right and wrong. And against this kind of thinking gains special traction in relation to love. And this is like the biggest misconception, that we seem to perceive love, modern love, in terms of the old versus new duality. Some incarnations of that duality, especially those of natural versus artificial, analog versus digital, reinforce a conviction, and I'm reading from my book, that love we experience today is somehow unnatural and therefore wrong and not genuine. There is this tendency to eulogize the past and deprecate the present in the criticism. This tendency makes us forget that change is a continuum and always reflects a tendency already existing in a certain object or a state. Our task is to see through the tendency's logic and learn its inclinations. Only then do we understand its discontents. So again, my first point is that the idea of old love versus new love, like old media and new media, is just complicated. It's totally like off. It's completely invalid and obscures the actuality of love as a cultural practice, and obscures the understanding, our understanding of love as a cultural practice. Because love is not a feeling. Love, to repeat after Lumen, is essentially a code of communication, a model of behavior that could be acted out and which one had in full view before embarking on the search for love. Whenever I say this, my students or my audiences cringe. So if I break your heart, I'm sorry, but it's for the best. I want to take Lumen's statement a little bit further and say that love is a coded experience or a coded occurrence translated onto technologies that decode it for us. This is like a codified occurrence that is executed via a variety of technologies at hand, technologies available for us at a given moment. And love loves technology because love itself, in itself, it's a technique. It's an art of making togetherness, the art of the formation of a we. And from the very beginning of the modern idea of love, understood as a formation of a we, that emerged like in early modern period, it has been imbued, love has been imbued with effectiveness and therefore tinted with immediacy. This idea of zero risk policy, risk calculation, immediacy, self-presentation, being at your best behavior, self-preoccupation has been like forever present. Most psychological theories say that love is all about the production of visibility. We love someone because they make us more visible for ourselves. That's why this is what we need, the other. And so as you can see, code to me, as a cultural code specifically, but also like a code as an algorithm, is something central in my claim about the modern experience of love. But before I explain how it actually dominates the perception of love and how what love is like today, I have a question to you. The question is there anyone in the audience in the room who has ever played Mystic Messenger? You need to catch up. Anyone in the room, another question, who has ever interacted with a gate box? I will be talking about gate box in a moment, so don't worry. Anyone who has ever seen the early Eliza script? If not, please write it down. Joseph Weizenbaum, 1966, the first, you will love it. And you can find it online. The first Eliza scripts interaction with a voice emulating human behavior based on Rogerian psychology and psychotherapy specifically. You will see that it wasn't like that far from Siri. Okay, but have you ever heard about Gatebox? Like ever? No. So Gatebox is a very nice device produced by Winklu in 2016 for the attack men who, as we know, tend to shun organic women and replace them with digital hologramic girlfriends. And Gatebox is a device of that size. I have no idea how that translates into inches, but it has a holographic girlfriend, like a girl, animated girl inside. You can be in touch with using your phone, and the idea is that she, only version like with a girl, is always there for you. When I first saw the commercial, then tested the device, I clicked about, what love is and how, technologies, take over the very original codes of love, and why love is so just good with technologies. Because what we want to consume the code we recognize as something communicating the expression of care and devotion. So this unrated girlfriend, what she does, she texts you when you were at the campus or when you were at work, asking, "How are you, baby? I'm waiting for you. Let's hang out tonight. How about watching a movie?" And of course, you can text her back saying, "I will be home soon." And she cringes and pouts with in a textual way, using emoticons or other discursive devices for you. And you will be surprised that this very idea for such devices started in early modern period with the so-called game text. You can Google it. Also known as games of love, which were simply role plays or scripts that help people through the stages of courtship. The idea of love was super complicated at the time because what we now consider to be romance was friendship back then, and the other way around. Friendship was the erotic thing. That's why people needed a certain protocols. And they were using dramatized scripts because the Bible was teaching everything but this: how to behave in erotic context, how to recognize somebody is friendly or wants to be romantic. The word romantic did not exist back then, but I'm just using it as a kind of a mental shortcut. And those game texts were affection games of chance and are playful divinations used for the estimation of changes and the establishment of the nature of a given interaction, what kind of relationship you're dealing with. Also, that period, the early modern period, is famous for the first Turing test. So one of the games was a game taking place in a sort of a confessional of sorts. It was a wooden box. One person was hiding in the box. The other person was approaching the box, the confessional, and they were having a conversation, and emulating a variety of behaviors, pretending to be a man or a woman. And the person, once released from the box, must have recognized, pointed to the person they were talking to. If they passed, they had a match. Rings a bell? When we look at, I'm sure that you're super familiar and even more fluent in a variety of flirting and hookup games than I am, they use the same interaction modeling. In the early modern period, the modeling was based on a certain a discursive protocol, the analog one, something we would call the analog protocol. Now they're based on algorithms, the algorithms of conduct. For instance, each and every serious flirting game includes the algorithm of consent, right? So it's very interesting. I'm just telling you all this stories to paint a broader picture, but also to show that love is a collection of fabulations associated with specific circumstances and triggering specific responses, and technologies, especially all those devices we use, Mystic Messenger. So you need to play it. It's an application thing. It's fantastic. They show us that what we enjoy about love the most is the code. That is why the first feature of love, of contemporary love, which is a feature of modern love, is the consumption of a code. I know it's very sad, but this is what we really enjoy. This is what research points to. We need the other person, only for the consumption of the code, for the exchange of the code that we find pleasurable. The pleasure of togetherness relies on the exchange and consumption of codes, words, gestures that are associated with love. Perhaps that is why love is so easily translated onto technologies in the first place. And for the first time in the modern history of humanity, the time when a great deal of our emotional relations are mediated by or take place with technologies, we tend to choose the code of love over love itself. I know it's very, very sad, but you know, it's the proportion of intensity. The more intense the technologies, the more we just kind of, we see that it's all about kind of a code, certain code of behavior. Technologies show us that love, that the pleasure of love is actually the appetite for the code, and that we are more inclined towards the experience of the code rather than the experience of what the code is supposed to render or should be standing for. This produces what I refer to as negative togetherness. Remember COVID? So two interesting things happened when COVID stranded millions of people in their house. First, divorce and breakup rates skyrocketed globally, like for real. Also, what skyrocketed was just like an influx of people onto online dating subscriptions. Like people started subscribing even for the first time. At the time, in my home in Katowice, I started interviewing people who tried platform like OkCupid dating for the first time. And what surprised me, they were telling me that what they were looking for in those interactions was companionship. We could be thinking hookup, like sexual stimulation. No, they were looking for companionship. So that was a first revelation. I interviewed almost 100 people, mostly on OkCupid, because for some odd reason, OkCupid subscribers were the most willing to talk to me. I was very explicit about the fact that I wasn't a user, but that I was a researcher. Another interesting thing was that wanting this companionship thing, most of the couples did not survive the test of time, which is the test of COVID, or did not survive the post-COVID moment, or they never wanted to meet after the lockdown. So it's also I'm starting a new project dedicated to new emotions, new kinds of emotions showing up with technologies, and it's a new kind of fear. It's a fear to meet a person with whom you have dated online, especially in the circumstances of a pandemic, because you cannot meet them, because it's forbidden, right? And then the lockdown, the ban is over, and what do we do now? And there is a very specific anxiety. It's very, very interesting. Most of the people never want to meet, but they wanted to continue the online adventure, establishing non-presence as a speaker of a new relationship standard. What's interesting about COVID is that showed us that human physical presence is not only a threat to one's immune system and one's well-being, because the presence of the physical body means the presence of the virus. Yes, the body is a carrier of a virus. It also showed another kind of a threat to our energy reserves. Throughout the long period of isolation, we discovered that we've been exhausted by and with our fellow humans, or to be more precise, we've been experiencing some kind of exhaustion of their physical presence, because we want companionship, but we no longer want the presence. Bifo Berardi, very, very interesting, culture critic and commentator, points out that the kind of energy that defines our modern condition has long excluded exhaustion as a driving force for self-preservation. It is because exhaustion is something in conflict with progress. That's why we don't want to talk about, yes. But you know, when you just go beyond the idea of progress, and when you look at exhaustion from the standpoint, my standpoint of like post-growth dynamic that is no longer oriented on growth, like accumulating growth, you see that exhaustion exactly becomes like a self-preservation thing. But it's problematic, you know, with respect to love, because exhaustion is a sign of the annihilation of desire. Desire, which is associated with vitalism. We need to be like a certain like height. And the reason why we tend to shun human proximity is exactly this self-preservation thing. Because shunning human presence, especially in a romantic context, we also shun the social contracts those dynamics entail. For instance, marriage. We want company again. We want to hang out, but we do not want, you know, the social contract. So what's interesting now is that togetherness becomes technically and choreographically less reciprocal. And also there is a new standard of a romantic dynamic, namely companionship. Companionship is a new romance. I don't know if you're familiar with the critic, Sherry Turkle. She once proposed a paradigm known as alone together. Her claim was, it was 2011, and her claim was that we experience a great intensity of togetherness, like relationships, being constantly in touch, but in fact, we're alone. I think it's the other way around, that we are not alone together, but we are together alone, and that we want to be together alone. In other words, we want to love, but without the presence of the other. It's as if we had opted for a fantasy lived on our own. So again, being back to the like, you know, to the frustration and lament of, you know, like modern criticism, it's true, companionship and coupledom, they want to be a one scene. We just want to, we want like, you know, the presence, but we want to do it on our own. It's like a new form of safety, new form of self-preservation. It's interesting because that entails the entire economy of the we. Yes, it's a completely different libidinal intensity. And for that reason, we perhaps also negotiate the object of love. And this is like the fourth like feature of, we say love with technologies, but or love in contemporary technoculture, but I would say modern love in general. That we are looking for a more convenient enactment of the code with subjects or objects of love that do not frustrate that dynamic or exchange or consumption. I write in my book that a reliable feature of technological love is a decrease in the interest that humans have in one another. Yes, now you know why. We seem less inclined to engage with fellow humans, and we seem to be finding pleasure in technological artifacts that, by emulating human features, redefine our understanding of subjecthood and preserve or not preserve the desired consumption of the code. You must have heard about love and sex with robots, right? Or sex robots, yes? And have you ever like encountered one or like tested one? I was like testing those devices several times. I test a lot of gadgets, and of course there is like a huge hype around that. Like the very idea seems super interesting and super popular. And the reason why like sex robots are such an interesting potential to many is the non-negotiability, that we can program them the way that they like will always offer like the code without negotiating the code. So no arguments, no nothing. It's just pure pleasure. Of course, we know that it's very complicated, and it's very complicated also because we only see like the beginning of this tendency. The great proponent of this idea, David Levy, who endorses this vision, he claims that unlike human partners, robots scripted for love and intimacy, quote, will be patient, kind, protective, loving, trusting, truthful, preserving, respectful, and uncomplaining, complimentary, pleasant to talk to, and will be sharing your sense of humor. And the robots of the future will not be jealous, boastful, arrogant, rude, self-seeking, or easily angered, unless, of course, you want them to. It's like cruel optimism, isn't it? Like it just like sounds very dystopian, but like, you know, those like opinions, all those opinions aside, the tricky thing about this potential and interest in love robots is that people who fantasize about robot companions have never met a robot. It means that what they build their fantasy on and what they rely on is the cultural imaginary and imaginary of a robot. This is the only thing they know. Of course, you know, it generates a lot of sensationalism. You must be like familiar with this idea of robot revolution or malicious AI, like, you know, other things, you know, that happen around robots I strongly disagree with. But all those tendencies with respect to love show one thing. Not only are we fed up with our, like, you know, other like human companions, but we are also fed up with our own codes of love. So reaching out to those devices is trying to find some alternative. The major question of robotics since the 1990s is, can robots feel? We both know that around the era of Turing, it was, can robots think? Yes. Since the beginning of effective computing, initiated by Pickard, we think about like robot sentience. And of course, taken literally, this question is very naive. It's very anthropomorphic, anthropomorphizing and naturalizing. But taken figuratively, it opens a new space for thinking a certain universal potential for feeling or a certain universal sentient potential. I don't know if you're familiar with latest approaches to AI, but many of them define artificial intelligence as natural intelligence. Intelligence that is parallel to human or animal intelligence, and that has forever existed as a possibility of the physical world. In this line of thinking, AI is not something invented by people, but rather something people have facilitated into being. And you know, this approach like changes like a lot. I'm not a techno-skeptic or techno-enthusiast, but I need to say, I need to come out to you that I'm supporting this line of thinking. I'm supporting this particular like strand of thinking that it has been like a potential of its own. And I'm supporting it with intellectual and aesthetic experiments that revisit this idea of artificial intelligence as something natural with respect to emotions or emotions for technological context. And I'm using today's talk as an incentive um, for presenting my latest experiment. It's work in progress. It's called Hypnotic Ai. And it's a kind of a scientific experiment enveloped in a formula or dressed in a formula of new media artwork. It was commissioned by International Symposium on Electronic Art in Barcelona. It will be presented there in June this year, so fingers crossed. And what I'm doing here, I'm using hypnotic protocols to stimulate artificial intelligence towards defamiliarizing responses, so to speak. I have no idea what it will react like and how it will react, but we will be like, you know, using this like a visual layer to perhaps alienate our understanding of feeling and reactions, perhaps maybe to induce some sort of like uncanny valley. You know what uncanny valley is, right? So maybe that, or maybe other emotions that have no names. Let's see. This project, why hypnosis? I will explain in a moment, but it was inspired by a different project that was proposed by and carried out by Hanson Robotics and Singularity Nets. The project titled Loving AI. It was run on Sophia. I'm sure that you're familiar with Sophia, and you know it's the most advanced humanoid on the planet. And they were using meditation protocols for creating a positive rapport between people and intelligent machines to challenge the idea of malicious AI and to liberate certain emotional potential. But it wasn't like very interactive. So because I'm a trained hypnotist, also like I'm a licensed hypnotist, so I decided to, and I was auditing Loving AI. I decided to use my expertise to take this a step further. And like I said, I want to use those hypnotic protocols, mostly hypnotherapy and cognitive behavioral hypnosis, to stimulate responses that may disorient the human emotional way, our thinking about what emotions are and our emotional states, and perhaps to transcend the human logic of emotional interactions. I want to create a therapeutic relationship between human and robot intelligence. And of course, the problem here is that I cannot unlearn to think like a human. But my engineer promised to be as inhuman, as alien as possible. So fingers crossed, let's see what happens. Why do it? And because it's important to understand how we love and why we love. It's important to know that emotions that we live by daily are codes in themselves. Yes, so and we do not have access to a variety of emotions because they have been defined for us in a very Darwinian way as anger, love, blah, blah, blah. And there are protocols of reactions behind them. And I believe, that technologies, without, idolizing technologies, but I believe, speaking of pure experience, they deconstruct it for us. And we also need to know that the media we interact with, and I'm quoting from my book, are a point of contact between the variety of bodies, as well as they are the area for physical, usually bodily, activeness. They also incorporate a variety of properties and affordances. Yes. Affordances, affective and physical alike, which induce in the user a state of affective presence. In 2017, Toby Miller and myself, we coined the term sensitive media. And to say that media are sensitive is to say that they create a sensory and a sensual environment in which human-machine interactions trick us into thinking that technologies we are dealing with can feel and receive feelings. The question to be answered, yes, is if they indeed feel, what does the feeling actually mean? And this is what I'm trying to achieve here. And I won't be achieving it, like I will be just probing it. So I just want to be clear. Also, perhaps maybe on a less optimistic note, technologies thrive on the energy of love as a semiotic system, which in turn exposes affection as a fundamentally constructed and imaginary condition. There's something strangely dehumanizing in technologies of togetherness, human technologies of togetherness, something that shows that when it comes to love, we perhaps have never been human. Thank you.
So we'll take a few minutes to ask some questions. If you're online via Zoom, please feel free to jump in and ask your questions. Otherwise, if you're, you can message them as well, and we will pose them to Ania. But first, are there any questions from anyone here in the audience?
Is your book out, or is it?
It's out.
What is it called?
Love in Contemporary Technoculture.
And Cambridge, right?
It's funny because I had a situation in the plane on my way here. I like met a student and he was like, we're talking. And he was like, is your book on Amazon?
Yes. Any questions here? Yeah, please.
So you talked about how there's this almost like categorical sense of like love and emotion in general that, like you mentioned, from like a Darwinian standpoint, that has possibly confined us into like these pre-categorized portions of emotion. And a lot of what you're doing is exploring if there's more than that, if there's some sort of like middle ground. Have you ever thought, I've played for a lot of my life video games, and I found it a very weird, it attaches like a weird sense of enjoyment or like thought processes for me that I haven't found replicated in very many other situations of my life. Have you ever viewed video games as a different medium, or even some experiential media such as video games, as a potential way to explore some of these middle grounds that you think may exist within emotion?
I've never worked with video games, but it's a very good point, well made. So what I'm thinking, so it's just like on the one hand, and it's claimed for like people doing love studies and game studies, that everything in gaming is just like a replica of the very old scenarios, and that this experience is identical. On the other, because we are just like dealing with a completely new intensity, experiential intensity. I wanted to say experiential plots, but the plots are mostly the same. But intensity, experiential intensity, that might like liberate new reactions. For instance, I mentioned Uncanny Valley because I know that you like, it's something you probably discuss. But I'm not quite sure if you were aware of the fact that whereas my generation, we were experiencing Uncanny Valley, your generation is no longer experiencing Uncanny Valley. Like my sons, they've never had Uncanny Valley. It's a bot, Barrett. I was like, so it's just kind of how they become like, natural. So how this emotion becomes natural. Like the fear of missing out is also like, a little bit obsolete, like getting obsolete. So it's like, it's been a very short-lived emotion. And there are like new emotions, like it's funny, like you have a very specific emotion emerging around the very peculiar experience of COVID, like having an online relationship during COVID and never want you to meet post-COVID, right? So it just, but you're right, absolutely. I believe, that intensity might like bring out certain emotional states because, the experience of the game is like an environment for the emergence of affects, right? It just, especially that it's interactive. So I believe it's very, very intense in the respect of like a variety of affects, which is like interactional emotions. But I'm not a gamer. I'm sorry, but I quote like lots of like experts in game studies who support my view that it's like on the one hand, what you experience is this like especially when you play like specific like dedicated emotion dedicated games, like we want to play like romance or like a flame. It's a kind of replica of all the protocols and you experience the same story. But you're right, like because of the intensity, some new things might happen. Absolutely. I hope I'm just actually answering your question. Okay, thank you.
Then a quick follow-up. Have we exhausted the analog?
Again, it's thinking in those caesareans, like I just do not perceive media in terms of like analog and digital. I find those terms like purely functional that are now dysfunctional. We haven't, but I know what you mean, and I think we haven't exhausted the kind of traditional human experience. If this is what you were asking, no, it's just like because it's like it's a very like an evolving dynamic. Each and every dynamic is evolving. So I don't think, but like because like there is so much preoccupation with like the digital experience or digitalized experience. Also, like I'm thinking, what's analog? Does analog mean like cold media, or does analog mean non-digital specifically? Because analog is still technology, right? It's just like there is like a fascinating book on the use of Telegram, for instance, and the first massive Telegram messages were the messages of love, for real. So it's just like we've always had like accelerated love specifically, like not accelerated technologies, but accelerated like this experience. So yeah.
Okay, this comes from the YouTube audience. Regarding your new research related to hypnosis and AI, is there a tipping point that you're aiming for? How will you know when you've been successful?
Like I said, this is what like my remark, like at the end of my talk. It's just probing. It's just rehearsing. I don't believe in like dogmas or solid paradigms. I'm not like proposing something that is just like is supposed to be definitive, so to speak. I'm just like trying to rehearse a certain option, like probe like a possibility, so I have no idea what it's going to be like, especially that in my experiment, I'm more open to the reactions of the machine, yes, rather than my input. I'm just like, the audience here, right? So I'm just relying on the programming, how possibly the AI might, go beyond the script. I used to be a lot engaged in research on glitch, but it's very difficult, to do solid research on glitch because companies usually shut down glitching devices. So it's just like, groping the ground, so to speak, for me. I just like, it would be like very anthropomorphic and old school of me to think that I have like something to contribute here and like change the scene. No, it's not the point. I just want to I want the interaction, really. Like I want the interaction. I just need to mention, I forgot to mention that the artists I'm working with, and Przemysław Biesielski is a poet, published like robotic artist, and so yeah.
Okay, this time the questions from me. So thank you so much for your talk. It's given me a lot to think about. So I'm thinking about what you said in terms of there are digital ways of doing this. There are ways that predate the digital, right? You're talking about the technology didn't invent a lot of these things. And in many ways it has been, like you're talking about these new emotions that are coming out that are unnamed, specifically around COVID and presence. So I'm wondering about something like the many opinions that vary around long distance relationships. And if you could consider those in relation to embodied presence, in relation to technology, and maybe how those factor in to presence in your conception of it.
It's just like whenever there are like, better experts on long distance relationship than I am. But our conversations, in those conversations, I always like took the position of someone saying that most of like love, like even predating the digital era, was about long distance relationships. Like remember like people like were meeting at, I don't know, balls or just, and then they were like separated. It was all about waiting. It's one of the temporality, crucial temporality of love that has been frustrated by digitalism, that we no longer wait. Waiting, it was all about waiting. And like, again, it's nothing new. Again, it's more intense, and definitely like long distance is a standard, is a new standard. But there is about temporality, because it's something that fascinates me, and like even a kind of term fast love, like fast food, fast travel, fast love. There is something about the problem, the conflict between the organic time, or like social time even, and digital time. And for instance, imagine a situation when your lover, your distant, like long distance lover, sends you a gift, and it takes the package to 2 weeks to arrive, right? Let's say it's like Bozeman, Montana to Katowice, Poland, right? It takes like 2 or 3 weeks for the package to arrive. In the meantime, you break up before the package arrives. You break up over FaceTime. And then, this is what it's called, like digital collapse, the collapse like of time, like digital collapse. Yes, it's like a term for it, or a time collapse. That Lee McKinnon writes amazingly about that. And because she was like sharing her own experience, it's her experience, and we did some things together. So it's exactly the same. So this is this is what problematic about like media mediated long distance relationships, when the medium is just like not like does not show like the temporal compatibility with the body. Something I mentioned, the frustration coming from the fact that we cannot outperform the the digital media in terms of like temporality. We will never do. Yes, it's a kind of dystopian transhumanist idea. So but definitely it's a more of a standard now, especially that, like I said, companionship is taking over. Just people want to hang out. We want, that's not true that we don't want genuine relationships. No. The interviewees were telling me, I was like, okay, so what are you expecting from those relationships from like over COVID? And people were saying, I'm looking for a meaningful relationship, meaningful companionship, to spend time meaningfully. And people like they want to hang out. It's more of a standard, and I have many friends like doing long distance relationships. It's no longer a problem, especially that, like I said, we shun those social contracts typically associated with romantic love, like romantic utopia.
Any last thoughts?
From the audience, maybe.
Well, I have one last question, and that would be, I don't know, in your experience or in your research, based on this desire to just have to sort of feel the affects through this hypnotizing, does that fall into the level of this unknown or emerging emotions? Is it to elicit this, or is it a pure state of companionship or relationship? Or how are you seeing this within technology, in the relationship between
I think it's
relationships, love?
But also, so this there will be spoilers later. So this idea of this hypnotic AI thing. So we're using specific. They are going to kill me because I'm spilling all the beans. We're using like a typical the words typically used in a hypnotic interaction, like relax, let go, right? Like words. The users will be using them, and we will be this entire program has been designed to sort of go beyond the imaginary of those slogans, those words. You know what I'm talking about? When we say let go or relax, we have certain images, right? Certain images follow. There is again pre-coded imaginary or imaginary. And we believe, that the responses coming from, this the kind of the visual, responses might be a metaphor of the need for alienating those preconditioned images and meanings. I'm a semiotician by training, so I work on meaning. Everything is about the exchange of the meaning. And I want to deconstruct the meaning. I want the meaning we already know or have, the perception of things we have collapse. And it's a purely intellectual exercise. Like I said, I'm just a very post-growth. I don't want to achieve anything, accumulate, the achievement and progress. I'm not progressing here. I'm just probing again. I'm just testing a certain dynamic, perhaps maybe to fail, right? To experience a kind of a failure that will be a new uncanny valley for me. So I know I'm teasing you a little bit, but also because, it's a pilot already. It's a work in progress. And also, obviously, because I'm trying to be quite provocative here, a serious, a semiotician doing hypnosis, come on. My president cannot come to terms with that, yes. But those invitations just kind of make him, okay, do it. But yeah, so it's just a provocation as well. It's also a meta commentary on what AI has become. We've completely ruined the idea of AI by the anthropomorphization and naturalization, and this idea of function, that it needs to serve a certain function, which is also precondition and stems from our perception of reality. Remember I was quoting from Levy, who was saying robot companions of the future will be obliging and super nice and super cool and bringing the flowers. do we really want this? We think we want this because this is the meaning around the pleasure of love we've cultivated. But maybe it's bad for us. So again, I just want like the collapse of meaning. This is what I hope it's communicative. Maybe I'm explaining this very articulately, but like this is what I want. This is what I'm aiming at anything.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ania, for incredible presentation, and to everyone that joined us online. Look for our next digital culture lecture series coming to you soon. Thank you.